The sun was shining brightly over London, casting golden rays onto the bustling streets surrounding Buckingham Palace. Tourists from every corner of the globe had gathered to witness one of the most iconic sights in the world, the changing of the guard ceremony. Cameras clicked incessantly as families posed for pictures, children pointed excitedly at the red-coated soldiers, and couples whispered romantic words against the backdrop of history. The air buzzed with excitement, a mix of awe and curiosity filling the atmosphere. Among the sea of visitors stood Alex Carter, a tall, lanky man with a cowboy hat perched on his head, a clear giveaway of his Texan roots. Alex wasn't your typical tourist. He prided himself on being adventurous, always seeking out ways to make his travels memorable. Whether it was climbing restricted areas or testing local laws just for kicks, Alex lived by the motto, "Rules are meant to be bent." His friends back home often joked that he'd find trouble wherever he went, but Alex didn't see it that way. To him, life was about living on the edge, pushing boundaries, and having fun while doing it. As Alex wandered closer to the palace gates, his eyes landed on the royal guard standing perfectly still like statues carved from stone. Their bright red tunics and bearskin hats made them look almost surreal amidst the modern chaos around them. They stood motionless, their faces expressionless, seemingly oblivious to the crowd snapping photos and whispering comments. Alex tilted his head, studying them curiously. How could someone stand so still for hours? Didn't they get bored? An idea began to form in his mind, an idea that would soon spiral out of control. Around him, warning signs were posted, reminding visitors not to touch, distract, or interfere with the guards in any way. Most people followed these rules without question, respecting the solemnity of the tradition before them. But Alex wasn't most people. He smirked as he read the signs, feeling a familiar thrill rise in his chest. What if he did something unexpected? Something no one else dared to do? After all, how much trouble could he really get into for a little harmless mischief? The thought lingered in his mind as he stepped closer to the barrier separating the crowd from the guards. Other tourists continued to admire the spectacle, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Alex's head. Some laughed quietly at jokes shared between friends, while others leaned in to explain the significance of the ceremony to their kids. It was a moment filled with wonder and reverence, for everyone except Alex. He glanced down at the ground and noticed a decorative flower filled with fine sand meant to enhance the beauty of the surroundings. Without hesitation, he crouched down and scooped up a handful of the soft grains. For a brief second, doubt flickered across his face. Was this really a good idea? But then he shook off the thought, convincing himself that nothing bad could come from a simple prank. Besides, who wouldn't laugh at seeing a stoic guard react to something as silly as sand? Little did Alex know, his impulsive decision was about to set off a chain of events that would change his trip, and possibly his life, forever. With a mischievous grin spreading across his face, Alex straightened up, clutching the handful of sand tightly in his palm. The grains felt cool and gritty against his skin, and for a moment, he hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was watching him. Most of the tourists were busy snapping photos or chatting animatedly with their companions, completely unaware of what Alex was about to do. A few feet away, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at one of the guards. "Why doesn't he move?" the child asked innocently. The mother chuckled softly, explaining how the guards were trained to stay still, no matter what happened. Alex's focus shifted back to the guard standing closest to him, a young soldier named Corporal James Whittaker. Dressed in his immaculate red tunic and towering bearskin hat, Whittaker looked every bit the part of a stoic protector of tradition. His posture was perfect, his gloved hands resting gently on the rifle slung across his chest. Not a single muscle moved, not even when a light breeze rustled the edges of his uniform. To Alex, this unwavering discipline seemed almost robotic, like something out of a movie. It fascinated him, but it also made him feel daring. "This'll be hilarious," Alex muttered under his breath. his confidence growing with each passing second. He took a step closer to the barrier, leaning slightly forward as though he were trying to get a better view of the ceremony. Then, without warning, he flicked his wrist and tossed the sand directly at Corporal Whittaker's face. The grains hit their mark with surprising accuracy, scattering across the guard's cheeks, nose, and eyes. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The crowd gasped collectively, the sound rippling through the area like a wave. Some people instinctively covered their mouths in shock, while others turned to stare at Alex, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. A woman nearby exclaimed, "What is wrong with you?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the stunned silence that had fallen over the group. A man holding a camera lowered it slowly, shaking his head in disapproval. Even the children, who moments ago had been giggling and pointing at the guards, now looked confused and uneasy. But Corporal Whittaker didn't react. Not a blink, not a twitch. Nothing. He remained perfectly still, just as he had been trained to do. Sand clung to his face, some of it slipping down onto his collar, but he showed no sign of discomfort or irritation. His composure was unshakable, a testament to years of rigorous practice and dedication to his role. For Alex, however, the lack of reaction only added fuel to his reckless behavior. He let out a loud laugh, clearly amused by what he saw as a harmless prank. "Come on, man. You're not even gonna flinch," Alex called out, his tone teasing. He cupped his hands around his mouth to amplify his voice, drawing even more attention to himself. "That's gotta sting, right? Or are you just too tough for that?" His words echoed through the square, earning him harsh glares from the surrounding tourists. One elderly gentleman stepped forward, wagging a finger at Alex. "Show some respect, son," he said firmly. "These men are here to protect us, not entertain your foolishness." Others nodded in agreement, murmuring amongst themselves about how unacceptable Alex's actions were. Yet despite the mounting disapproval, Alex seemed unfazed, basking in the chaos he had created. Unbeknownst to him, though, the situation was escalating quickly. Nearby police officers stationed around the palace grounds had taken notice of the commotion. Two uniformed figures began making their way toward the scene, their expressions stern and purposeful. Tourists parted to let them through, many pointing accusingly at Alex as they whispered heatedly about what they had witnessed. The mood had shifted dramatically, from awe and admiration of the royal guards to outrage and frustration directed at the man who had dared to disrupt the sacred tradition. As the officers approached, Alex finally started to realize that his so-called harmless prank might have consequences far beyond what he had anticipated. But by then, it was too late to turn back. As the two police officers closed in on Alex, the crowd around him began to tighten like a noose. People whispered furiously, their voices carrying tones of anger and disbelief. Some craned their necks to get a better look at the man who had dared to throw sand at a royal guard, while others pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. The atmosphere, once filled with excitement and wonder, now crackled with tension. It was as though everyone collectively held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Corporal James Whittaker, meanwhile, remained an unshakable pillar of discipline. Despite the sting of sand clinging to his face and the murmurs of disapproval rippling through the crowd, he stood perfectly still. His training had prepared him for moments like this, moments when patience and composure were tested to their limits. Every fiber of his being was focused on maintaining his position, refusing to let even the slightest reaction slip through. To anyone watching, it seemed almost superhuman, a display of unwavering dedication that only deepened the crowd's respect for him. But not everyone shared this admiration. A group of tourists standing near the front began voicing their outrage loudly, directing their frustration squarely at Alex. One woman, clutching her camera tightly, turned to her husband and said, "How can someone disrespect something so important? This isn't just some silly game." Her words resonated with those around her, and soon others joined in, calling Alex's behavior disgraceful and unacceptable. Even children, sensing the gravity of the situation, stayed unusually quiet, their wide eyes fixed on the scene before them. Alex, however, seemed oblivious to the growing storm of disapproval swirling around him. At first, he tried to laugh it off, shrugging his shoulders as if to say, "What's the big deal?" But as more people glared at him and muttered under their breath, a flicker of unease crossed his face. He glanced over his shoulder, noticing the two police officers moving steadily closer. Their expressions gave nothing away, but there was a firmness in their strides that made Alex's stomach churn. For the first time since tossing the sand, doubt crept into his mind. Had he gone too far? The officers finally reached him, their presence commanding immediate attention. One of them, a tall man with sharp features and a calm demeanor, addressed Alex directly. "Sir, could you please step aside with us for a moment?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. There was no room for argument in his voice, and Alex knew instinctively that resisting would only make things worse. Wait, Alex stammered, holding up his hands defensively. "It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." His attempt to explain himself fell flat, drowned out by the chorus of disapproving murmurs from the crowd. Someone shouted, "A joke? That's no way to treat our guards." Another voice chimed in, "You should be ashamed of yourself." The weight of their collective judgment pressed down on Alex, making him shift uncomfortably where he stood. Meanwhile, Corporal Whittaker continued to endure the aftermath of the prank in silence. Though his eyes remained forward, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of satisfaction, knowing that his discipline had sent a powerful message. This wasn't about him. It was about the institution he represented, the centuries-old tradition of honor and service that defined the Royal Guards. And in that moment, surrounded by chaos, Whittaker became a symbol of resilience and dignity. As Alex reluctantly followed the officers away from the scene, the crowd began to disperse slowly, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by somber reflection. Many lingered long enough to watch the young troublemaker being led away, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others returned their focus to the guards, offering nods of gratitude or quiet applause for their steadfastness. What had started as a day of celebration and curiosity had transformed into a lesson about respect and the consequences of failing to show it. The officers led Alex to a quiet corner of the palace grounds, far enough from the crowd that their conversation wouldn't draw unnecessary attention, but close enough to remind him of the gravity of his actions. One officer gestured for Alex to sit on a nearby bench, while the other stood watchfully beside him, arms crossed and expression stern. The playful smirk Alex had worn just moments ago was now replaced by an uneasy frown. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. "All right," the taller officer began, pulling out a small notepad from his pocket. His voice was calm but carried a tone of authority that made it clear he meant business. "Let's start with your name." "Alex Carter," came the reply, hesitant and quieter than before. For someone who had been so bold just minutes earlier, Alex now seemed unusually subdued. Perhaps it was the realization that this wasn't going to blow over as quickly as he'd hoped, or maybe it was the disapproving stares of the crowd still lingering in his mind. "And what exactly were you thinking when you threw sand at the guard?" the officer asked, raising an eyebrow. His question hung in the air like a challenge, daring Alex to justify his behavior. Alex hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. I didn't think it was a big deal," he admitted, his Texas accent thickening under pressure. "It was just supposed to be funny, a little prank. I didn't mean any harm." The second officer, who had been silently observing until now, stepped forward. "A prank?" he repeated, his tone sharp enough to cut through Alex's feeble defense. "You do realize these guards are here to protect one of the most important institutions in our country, don't you? They're not here for entertainment." Alex opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. The weight of the situation was finally sinking in. What had seemed like harmless fun just moments ago suddenly felt reckless and disrespectful. He glanced toward the guards, standing stoically in the distance, their unwavering discipline a stark contrast to his impulsive behavior. This isn't just about throwing sand, the first officer continued, flipping his notebook shut. It's about showing respect for the guards, for the monarchy, and for the people who come here to admire them. You've disrupted that today, Mr. Carter, and that has consequences. At the mention of consequences, Alex's face paled slightly. Consequences, he echoed, his voice tinged with unease. What kind of consequences? The officers exchanged a glance before the taller one spoke again. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard is no small matter. It's considered a criminal offense under UK law. Depending on how this plays out, you could be facing charges and possibly even jail time. Jail time. The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He blinked rapidly, trying to process what he was hearing. Jail. For throwing sand. It sounded absurd, yet the serious expressions on the officers' faces told him they weren't joking. Panic began to creep into his thoughts, and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Look, I'm sorry, okay? I didn't know it was such a big deal. If I'd known. But you did know. The second officer interrupted firmly. There are signs everywhere reminding visitors to respect the guards. You chose to ignore them because you thought it would be funny. Well, let me tell you something. This isn't funny for anyone else. As the officers continued questioning him, Alex's bravado melted away completely. He slumped back against the bench, running a hand through his hair as reality set in. This wasn't just some minor incident that could be laughed off. It was a mistake with real repercussions. And as much as he wanted to argue or explain himself further, deep down, he knew they were right. By the time the officers finished gathering details and escorted Alex to a nearby police vehicle, a small crowd had gathered once more, watching silently as he was driven away. Some shook their heads in disappointment, while others whispered among themselves about how justice was being served. For Alex, the ride to the station was long and uncomfortable, a stark reminder of how quickly things can spiral out of control when you act without thinking. The police station was quiet, almost eerily so, compared to the chaos Alex had left behind at Buckingham Palace. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a harsh glow over the sterile room where Alex now sat. His hands rested on the cold metal table in front of him, his fingers drumming nervously against its surface. Across from him, one of the officers who had arrested him reviewed his case file, flipping through pages with deliberate slowness. Every tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than the last, amplifying Alex's growing sense of dread. So, the officer finally said, breaking the silence, "Let's talk about what happens next." He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "You've been charged with assault and disorderly conduct. Do you understand what that means?" Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. I guess," he replied hesitantly. "But isn't this kinda extreme? I mean, it was just sand." "It wasn't just sand," the officer countered firmly, his voice steady but firm. "It was an act of disrespect towards someone performing their duty. An important duty, I might add. These guards represent centuries of tradition and service. When you threw that sand, you didn't just embarrass yourself, you disrespected an entire institution." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. He wanted to argue, to insist that it had all been a harmless prank, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew the officer was right. No matter how much he tried to rationalize it, there was no denying that his actions had crossed a line. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a heavy blanket, making it hard to breathe. "Look," Alex said after a long pause, his voice softer now, tinged with regret. "I really messed up. I didn't think about any of that stuff when I did it. I thought it'd be funny. Stupid, I know. But I never meant to cause trouble." The officer studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Intent doesn't change the outcome, Mr. Carter. What matters is the impact of your actions. And today, Your actions caused a scene that disrupted hundreds of people and showed blatant disregard for authority." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "That being said, we'll take your apology into account. But apologies don't erase consequences. You're going to have to face them head-on." With that, the officer stood up and left the room, leaving Alex alone with his thoughts. For the first time since arriving in London, Alex felt truly isolated. The thrill of adventure he'd chased so relentlessly during his travels had turned sour, replaced by guilt and shame. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, the laughter, the gasps, the angry stares, and cringed at the memory of it all. How could he have been so reckless? A short while later, another officer returned with paperwork in hand. "Here's the deal," he explained as he slid a form across the table. "You'll be fined for your behavior, and you'll serve a brief sentence minus 24 hours behind bars. Consider it a lesson learned." Alex stared at the document, his heart sinking further. Jail. Even if it was only for a day, the idea of being locked up felt surreal. Back home in Texas, he'd always prided himself on living life on his own terms, pushing boundaries without ever facing serious repercussions. Now, sitting in that cold, sterile room, he realized how wrong he'd been to assume he could get away with anything. As they led him to a holding cell, Alex couldn't help but reflect on how quickly everything had spiraled out of control. One impulsive decision, a handful of sand tossed carelessly, had landed him here, stripped of his freedom and dignity. It was a humbling experience, one that forced him to confront not just the consequences of his actions, but also the kind of person he wanted to be moving forward. By the time Alex was escorted to his holding cell, news of his antics had already spread far beyond the confines of Buckingham Palace. Social media platforms lit up like fireworks, with videos of the incident going viral within hours. Tourists who had witnessed the scene shared their clips online, captioning them with phrases like, "Disrespectful tourist throws sand at Royal Guard," and "What not to do in London." The internet, always hungry for drama, devoured the story whole, turning Alex into a global laughingstock and a cautionary tale. Back in Texas, Alex's family woke up to a barrage of notifications on their phones. Friends and acquaintances began tagging them in posts, asking if the man in the cowboy hat causing chaos in London was really their son. At first, they dismissed it as some bizarre coincidence, until they saw the video for themselves. There he was, unmistakably Alex, tossing sand with a smirk that made him look more foolish than clever. His mother sat stunned, her coffee cup halfway to her lips, while his father muttered under his breath, "That boy never learns." Local news outlets soon picked up the story, painting Alex as an example of reckless entitlement. Headlines blared across TV screens: "American tourist arrested after mocking Royal Guard," and "Texan causes international incident at Buckingham Palace." Talk shows joked about the incident, comedians mocked his accent, and memes featuring Alex's face popped up everywhere. Even late-night hosts couldn't resist poking fun at the situation, dubbing him Sandman and quipping that he should stick to beaches instead of palaces. For Alex, locked away in his small bare cell, none of this was immediately visible, but the shame crept in anyway. As he lay on the hard bench, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the image of Corporal Whittaker standing motionless despite the sand hitting his face. That moment of discipline haunted him, a glaring reminder of how immature and selfish his actions had been. He replayed the crowd's reactions in his mind, the gasps, the glares, the angry whispers, and felt a deep pang of regret. For years, he'd prided himself on being fearless and spontaneous, but now those traits seemed less like strengths and more like flaws. Meanwhile, back home, friends and neighbors distanced themselves from Alex almost instantly. People he thought were close to him deleted photos together from social media or unfollowed his accounts. Some even went so far as to leave scathing comments on articles about him, disowning any connection to the man in the headlines. "I don't know him," one former friend wrote beneath a local news post. "He doesn't speak for us." Even worse, Alex's employer, a construction company where he worked part-time between travels, called him late that night. They explained that his behavior had damaged their reputation and asked him to resign voluntarily. "We can't afford to be associated with someone who acts like that," his boss said bluntly over the phone. Alex listened silently, feeling the walls closing in around him. As dawn broke outside the station window, Alex realized something profound. This wasn't just a temporary setback. The ripple effects of his actions would follow him long after he left the cell. Whether it was losing respect, damaging relationships, or jeopardizing his future opportunities, the cost of his harmless prank was far greater than he could have imagined. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one he knew he had no choice but to accept. The courtroom was small and solemn, with rows of wooden benches filled with curious onlookers who had come to witness the fallout from Alex's infamous stunt. Reporters scribbled notes furiously in the corner, while cameras clicked softly outside the building, capturing every detail of his arrival. Alex sat nervously at the defendant's table, his cowboy hat tucked under his arm, as if shedding even a hint of bravado. His hands trembled slightly as he fidgeted with the hem of his shirt, his eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutor, and the crowd gathered behind him. When the judge entered the room, everyone rose respectfully. The atmosphere shifted instantly, becoming heavier, more serious. As Alex took his seat again, he felt the full weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just some minor legal formality. It was a reckoning for his actions. The prosecutor began by outlining the case against Alex, emphasizing the gravity of assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. "This is not merely an issue of bad behavior," she stated firmly, her voice echoing through the quiet room. "It is about showing respect for institutions that represent our nation's history and values. Mr. Carter's actions were reckless, disrespectful, and unacceptable." Alex listened intently, his chest tightening with each word. He wanted to interrupt, to explain himself, but he knew better than to speak out of turn. Instead, he nodded occasionally, trying to show that he understood, even though understanding didn't make the guilt any easier to bear. When it was his turn to address the court, Alex stood slowly, clearing his throat before speaking. His voice wavered at first, but he forced himself to continue. "Your Honor," he began, "I want to say I'm truly sorry for what I did. It was wrong, and I regret it deeply. I never meant to disrespect anyone or cause trouble. I let my own immaturity get the best of me, and I take full responsibility for my actions." His apology hung in the air, met with mixed reactions. Some in the audience exchanged skeptical glances, clearly unconvinced by his words, while others softened slightly, perhaps seeing genuine remorse in his expression. The judge studied him carefully, her gaze piercing yet fair. "Mr. Carter," she said after a long pause, "your apology is noted. However, apologies alone cannot undo the harm caused by your actions. You disrupted a national ceremony, disrespected those tasked with protecting tradition, and embarrassed not only yourself, but also your country. Actions have consequences, and today you must face yours." With that, the judge delivered her verdict: a hefty fine, community service hours to be completed upon returning to the United States, and a short jail sentence already served during his 24-hour detention. While the punishment could have been much harsher, Alex felt no relief, only a deep sense of accountability settling over him. As he left the courthouse later that day, surrounded by reporters shouting questions, Alex kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He climbed into a waiting car arranged by the U.S. Embassy, grateful for the privacy it offered. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to reflect honestly on everything that had happened. The experience had humbled him in ways he never expected. Sitting in that cell, facing judgment from strangers, and hearing the disappointment in his family's voices made him realize how reckless he'd been. He thought back to Corporal Whittaker's unwavering discipline and wondered how someone could remain so composed when provoked. In that moment, Alex resolved to change, not just for himself, but for the people he'd hurt along the way. Though the road ahead would be challenging, Alex knew this was a chance to grow. And as the car pulled away from the courthouse, he silently vowed to prove, to others and to himself, that he could learn from his mistakes. In the days following his release, Alex found himself sitting alone in a quiet cafe near Heathrow Airport, nursing a cup of coffee as he prepared to board his flight back to Texas. The chaos of the past few days felt like a distant storm that had finally passed, leaving behind a trail of lessons he couldn't ignore. He scrolled through his phone absent-mindedly, wincing at the headlines and comments still circulating online. Some called him an embarrassment to Americans abroad. Others demanded stricter consequences for tourists who disrespected local traditions. But amid the criticism, there were also voices urging forgiveness, a reminder that everyone deserves a second chance. Determined to make amends, Alex decided to issue a public apology. With the help of the U.S. Embassy, he drafted a heartfelt statement addressing not just the incident, but also the broader implications of his actions. "I deeply regret what I did," he wrote. "Throwing sand at a member of the Queen's Guard was disrespectful, immature, and unacceptable. I failed to understand the significance of the institution I mocked, and for that, I am truly sorry. To Corporal Whittaker, the Royal Guards, and everyone affected by my behavior, I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me." The statement went live on social media platforms, accompanied by a photo of Alex standing outside Buckingham Palace, his hat off and his expression solemn. Within hours, reactions poured in. Some praised his honesty and willingness to own up to his mistakes, while others remained skeptical, questioning whether his apology was genuine or simply a way to salvage his reputation. Despite the mixed responses, Alex felt a small sense of relief, knowing he had taken responsibility for his actions. Back in Texas, life didn't immediately return to normal. Friends and acquaintances continued to keep their distance, and whispers about the guy who threw sand lingered in his hometown. But instead of retreating into self-pity, Alex channeled his energy into proving he had changed. He began volunteering at a local veterans center, helping organize events and fundraisers to support retired soldiers and their families. It wasn't glamorous work, but it gave him a chance to honor the discipline and sacrifice he had once so carelessly dismissed. One evening, while sorting donations at the center, Alex struck up a conversation with an elderly veteran named Harold. Over coffee, Harold shared stories of his time serving overseas, emphasizing the importance of respect for one's peers, for authority, and for traditions upheld by generations before them. As Alex listened, he realized how much he had taken for granted during his travels. His reckless need for thrills had blinded him to the deeper meaning behind the places he visited and the people he encountered. Months later, Alex stood in front of a group of high school students during a career day presentation. Invited by a teacher who knew his story, he spoke candidly about his experience in London, the mistake he made, the consequences he faced, and the lessons he learned. "Sometimes we think rules don't apply to us," he told the students, his voice steady and sincere. "But they exist for a reason, to protect what matters most. Respect isn't just a word, it's a choice we make every day." As the students applauded politely, Alex felt a glimmer of redemption. He knew he couldn't erase the past, nor could he undo the embarrassment he'd caused. But he could use his story to remind others of the importance of humility, thoughtfulness, and cultural awareness. The incident would always be part of him, a scar etched into his memory, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it served as a turning point, pushing him toward growth and accountability. And as he walked out of the school auditorium that afternoon, greeted by the crisp autumn air, Alex allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the positive impact he might have on those around him.